the dimly lit corridors of medieval authority, where empires rose upon the shattered hopes of children, a young girl was destined to become both monarch and captive before reaching her teenage years. Isabella of France later etched into history as the she-wolf began her queenship not in celebration, but in sorrow. She was not allowed to express. Her tale exposes the ruthless mechanism of medieval politics, a world where children served as bargaining chips and matrimony was just another form of battle. In the year 1308, across the stormy waters of the English Channel, meticulous plans were unfolding for a wedding that would realign the balance of two realms. Yet this was far from a romantic saga. The bride, a mere 12 years old, spoke only French and was paralyzed by fear of the ocean voyage that would carry her into an unfamiliar court. Her groom, Edward II of England, was 24, far more devoted to his male companions than to producing heirs with his adolescent wife. Isabella's bridal gown, made from cloth of gold and elaborate embroidery, was so heavy it nearly matched her own weight. Writers of the time remarked that she had to be physically supported as she made her way down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, not from timidity, but because of the literal burden of her ceremonial garment. The irony was striking. A child overwhelmed by emblems of sovereignty she was too young to grasp, let alone command. The wedding itself spanned 4 grueling hours. Conducted entirely in Latina language Isabella barely understood. She stood motionless, voiceless, while archbishops sanctified a union that would shape half a century of English destiny. As a golden crown was set upon her head, it was noted her neck bowed under its weight, a haunting sign of the burdens awaiting her. As the peal of church bells swept through London to welcome its new queen, Isabella of France stepped into a gilded prison. She was no longer the sheltered daughter of the French court, but a strategic pawn in English politics. Her childhood ended beneath a crown she had never wished to wear. The royal banquet that followed would mark her final moment of innocence. Positioned at the ceremonial table, next to a husband who scarcely looked at her, surrounded by nobles conversing in a tongue she had yet to master, Isabella began to feel the crushing solitude that would shadow her reign. No longer a girl, and not yet a woman, she was trapped in the cruel liminality of royal girlhood. That night, the wedding night was, according to records, mercifully short. It signaled the beginning of Isabella's harsh indoctrination into the grim truths of aristocratic marriage. At the age of 12, she was expected to bear heirs for the English crown. While maneuvering through the treacherous intrigues of courtly politics, her French caretakers had been dismissed, her childhood possessions removed, her innocence sealed away beneath ornate robes and strict protocols. The structure of arranged marriage among medieval royals was a calculated weapon of diplomatias, methodical and cold as any siege tower. Young nobles like Isabella were designated as tools of foreign policy before they could speak in full sentences. Their betrothals were negotiated based on geography, trade prospects, and military strategy. The emotional and personal toll such deals inflicted was of no concern in a system where political gain eclipsed human suffering. Discussions surrounding Isabella's future marriage began before she could even walk. For years, French and English negotiators wrangled over the details: her dowry, the land transfers that would accompany her, and the exact stipulations of the alliance that her union was intended to secure. The tone of these talks resembled that of property deals. Isabella's desires were never part of the equation. King Philip IV of France, Isabella's father, saw her marriage as central to his diplomatic strategy with England. By marrying his daughter into the English royal family, He aimed to neutralize a long-standing military rival and potentially steer the direction of England's foreign affairs. Isabella wasn't just a pawn, she was his most valuable asset. Her ability to bear sons who would blend French allegiance with English blood made her more precious than any sum of gold or stretch of land. The official marriage agreement, still stored in England's royal archives, stands as a chilling document of medieval legalism. It meticulously outlines her dowry, the structure of her household, and even limits the number of French attendants she was allowed to keep. Most disturbing were the rules that governed her personal behavior. Isabella was forbidden from contacting her family without English consent, banned from leaving England unless granted royal approval, and subjected to recurring inspections to confirm her virginity remained intact until the marriage was physically consummated. Edward II's preferences, meanwhile, were no secret to the French court. His intense attachments to certain male companions, especially Piers Gaveston, had become the subject of European political whispers. Philip IV was well aware that his daughter would be paired with a man unlikely to show her affection. But so long as she produced legitimate children, this was deemed an acceptable sacrifice. Though the age gap between Isabella and Edward reflected common royal practice, it produced a uniquely volatile situation. Edward came of age steeped in the blood and politics of military campaigns, while Isabella had been reared in the sheltered cocoon of the French court. Their union was less a diplomatic partnership than a tragic collision between battle-hardened pragmatism and untouched innocence. Upon the public announcement of her engagement, Isabella's training to become queen commenced in earnest. French instructors educated her on English traditions, legal structures, and the family trees of noble lineages. She practiced writing in English calligraphy, memorized the names and faces of high-ranking courtiers, and was drilled in the elaborate rules that governed English palace etiquette. Yet nowhere in this rigorous preparation was she taught how to survive the mental and emotional isolation awaiting her. The gilded confinement of queenship. Westminster Palace, her new royal residence, was both splendid and suffocating, a grand showcase of power that doubled as a form of containment. Her private chambers, while adorned with luxury, operated as an elegant prison where every move was dictated by ceremony. Every interaction filtered through handlers, and her role continuously manipulated for political ends. Her daily life followed a strict script. At dawn, chapel bells would summon her from sleep. She joined her English ladies in waiting for morning devotions, took carefully arranged meals at set times, and spent her remaining hours engaged in activities considered suitable for a royal consort. Reading was allowed, but only books that passed inspection by her English supervisors. Music was permitted too, so long as it didn't evoke too much nostalgia for her homeland. The young queen's communication was tracked with the precision of a military operation. Every letter she received was opened and read by English officials before ever reaching her hands. Her own outgoing messages were subjected to the same scrutiny, with politically sensitive phrases either blacked out or saved as proof of suspected disloyalty. This web of surveillance extended into a social circle. Several of her English ladies-in-waiting were tasked with reporting back to the king's advisors, turning casual conversation into a source of constant risk. The physical aspect of her confinement deepened her emotional seclusion. Isabella's chambers were located in an isolated section of the palace, reachable only through guarded corridors and locked passageways. She could not stroll the gardens without an official escort, nor visit the kitchens or stables without prior permission. Any journey beyond the palace walls required a full royal escort and days of formal approval. Her early interactions with Edward II were marked by formal distance and occasional acts of startling disregard. Completely engrossed in his infatuation with Piers Gaveston, the king treated Isabella as a burdensome diplomatic obligation. He would go for weeks without addressing her directly, relying on attendants to relay his word 7. When they were seated in the same chamber, the emotional strain of this cold treatment did not go unnoticed. Chroniclers from the time observed a troubling transformation in Isabella. Once praised as spirited and clever, she became withdrawn and eerily quiet. She developed anxious habits, biting her fingernails until they bled, tugging at her hair during public events, and flinching at loud or sudden noises. These outward behaviors reflected the relentless pressure she endured. Even food became a psychological battleground. The elaborate meals delivered to her were often left untouched, not due to lack of appetite, but because dining in front of others meant that each movement could be interpreted politically. Isabella learned to suppress her hunger as she suppressed her grief, upholding regal composure while slowly wasting away both physically and emotionally. The humiliation of the Gaveston affair. Among all the indignities of her early queenship, none was more degrading than the overt favoritism Edward II showed to Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight, whose grip on the king both fascinated and appalled England's nobility. Their relationship was so brazen that it turned Isabella into a mere ornament within her own court, stripping her of even symbolic importance. Gaveston had been Edward's close companion since boyhood and was elevated to the prestigious title of Earl of Cornwall shortly after Edward's coronation. Observers of the era described him as charming, bold, and ruthlessly ambitious, using his proximity to the king to amass fortune and influence, all while displaying outright disdain for English traditions and aristocrats. His behavior toward Isabella was especially insulting. He openly mocked her, calling her the French wench, and making jokes about her pronunciation and manners in front of the court. The most humiliating moment of Isabella's early reign came during her coronation banquet, when Piers Gaveston arrived adorned in jewels that had originally been crafted as ceremonial gifts for the Queen. The Earl had persuaded Edward to bestow upon him Isabella's own treasures, including a stunning ruby necklace specially designed for the occasion. Forced to sit beside the king and his favored companion, Isabella maintained a mask of regal composure, even as her dignity was publicly stripped away. Edward's preferential treatment of Gaveston extended far beyond personal affectionate, actively eroded Isabella's role as queen. At formal court gatherings, Gaveston occupied the seat to Edward's immediate right, a place traditionally reserved for the queen. When foreign dignitaries arrived, they were instructed to present their formal greetings to Gaveston first, while Isabella received little more than a token nod of recognition. Though the romantic aspect of Edward and Gaveston's bond was never officially recorded, contemporaries widely believed it to be sexual in nature. Chronicles of the era detail their sharing of private quarters, the exchange of intimate tokens, and displays of closeness that startled even a court used to indulgent behavior. For Isabella, watching her husband pour affection and honor onto another man was a daily, agonizing reminder of her invisibility and her lack of significance within her own marriage. Her relatives in France were appalled by reports of her treatment. King Philip IV dispatched angry correspondence to Edward II, insisting that his daughter be treated with respect and threatening to revoke French support for England's military endeavors unless conditions improved. Rather than helping, these diplomatic overtures worsened Isabella's plight. Edward, feeling insulted, doubled down on his dismissiveness. The painful lessons of the Gaveston affair were not lost on Isabella. From this period of humiliation, she developed a deeper understanding of power, how it was wielded, abused, and manipulated. She learned to observe in silence, to remember every slight, and to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The indignities she suffered as a disregarded child queen would later fuel her evolution into the formidable she-wolf of Francia woman, who would eventually topple both lovers and monarchs. The machinery of child marriage in medieval Europe. The practice of child marriage among royal dynasties was embedded within meticulously constructed legal and cultural systems that valued political strategy over personal well-being. Isabella's life exemplifies how children, especially girls, were molded into diplomatic tools long before they could comprehend their destinies. Under canon law, the Church's legal code governing marriage, both bride and groom were supposed to give their consent. But in the case of children like Isabella, this approval was presumed to be the responsibility of their parents or legal guardians. The modern idea of informed consent had no place in a society where children's choices were irrelevant and their voices unheard. Even the consummation of royal marriages was treated as a matter of public record and political interest, documented in unnerving detail. Isabella's marriage to Edward II remained unconsummated until she reached what court physicians defined as physical maturity, the age of 15. Yet the 3-year delay between marriage and consummation brought with it its own form of psychological torment. Isabella existed in a suspended state no longer quite a child, yet not fully recognized as a wife while enduring periodic medical inspections to confirm her virginity. The prevailing medical theories of the medieval era were crude and often harmful. Royal physicians prescribed concoctions meant to hasten her physical development, including herbal remedies and dietary regimens that modern science would deem detrimental. The young queen was repeatedly examined for physical maturity by male doctors, often in the company of court officials, procedures that would now be classified as institutional abuse. The strategic considerations behind Isabella's marriage extended down to the precise timing of key life events. Her first pregnancy was orchestrated to align with auspicious astrological readings and political convenience. When she didn't conceive immediately after consummation, royal astrologers and physicians were summoned to identify the best windows for future attempts, reducing her fertility to an issue of national security. During this time, Isabella's household was deliberately structured for political advantage, not personal comfort. Her English ladies-in-waiting were chosen for their family loyalties to Edward II, rather than their ability to offer empathy or companionship. Her French attendants had all been dismissed, severing her final links to her native language and culture. This systematic isolation had a crushing psychological effect, made worse by the complete lack of understanding about childhood trauma or emotional health in medieval society. Isabella's visible suffering was not interpreted as a response to abuse, but as a sign of feminine frailty. Symptoms that modern medicine would identify as anxiety or depression were instead blamed on imbalances of bodily humors or insufficient spiritual devotion. The burden of bearing heirs. Isabella's first pregnancy, at age the 17th of March, marked a turning point. She was no longer a ceremonial figure, but a vital vessel for the royal bloodline. The unborn child symbolized not only England's future, but also the political justification for her entire marriage. Still, pregnancy in the royal court was a time not of celebration, but of extreme pressure fraught with physical dangers and political expectation. News of her condition was kept secret until the 4th month, when the baby's movements could be felt. In this world, royal childbirth was not a private matter, but a geopolitical concern. Everything from trade treaties to wartime strategies could hinge on the promise of a male successor. French and English envoys alike scrutinized Isabella's changing appearance for confirmation of a future monarchone who could bind their nations together. But medieval obstetrics was an alarming mix of folk superstition, primitive healthcare, and political manipulation. Court physicians dictated every aspect of Isabella's lifestyle, not to ensure her safety, but to maximize the chances of a healthy male heir. She was barred from eating certain foods, made to ingest specific tonics, and subjected to invasive inspections, all in service of the child she carried, often at the expense of her own comfort, dignity, and health. The birth of Edward III in 1312 marked a fleeting victory for Isabella, momentarily boosting her standing at court. At last, she had fulfilled her most critical duty as queen, producing a male heir who ensured the continuity of the monarchy and legitimized her position. But this triumph came at a devastating emotional cost. Her identity as a mother was quickly overshadowed by her role as a royal progenitor, with members of the court already speculating about the timing of a second son. Her bond with her newborn child was filtered through an impersonal system of ceremonial custom and political oversight. As was customary in royal households, infant princes were entrusted to designated nurses and tutors, not reared by their mothers. Isabella's interactions with Edward III were confined to formal events and closely monitored encounters. The future King of England, destined for martial greatness, barely knew the woman who bore him a calculated distance, intended to prevent maternal sway over his political development. The pressure to expand the royal line persisted throughout Isabella's fertile years, each new pregnancy scrutinized like a military operation. Court doctors tracked her reproductive cycles, administered fertility aids, and offered recommendations for the most auspicious times to conceive. When pregnancies ended in miscarriages, they did on multiple occasions, Isabella endured not only personal sorrow but public disapproval for failing to uphold her maternal obligations. The emotional cost of this clinical, state-controlled motherhood was profound. Isabella was expected to perform the role of nurturing parent in public while suppressing personal attachment to facilitate the use of her children as diplomatic tools. When her daughter Joan was pledged in infancy to a Scottish prince, Isabella was forced to express joy before the court, even as she privately mourned yet another child, lost to political necessity. The Despenser tyranny and the path to rebellion after the execution of Piers Gaveston at the hands of disaffected nobles in 1312. Edward II's devotion shifted to Hugh Despenser the Younger, whose presence at court would prove even more destructive. Chroniclers of the time labeled this period the Despenser tyranny, a fitting name for the oppressive rule that would ultimately push Isabella toward rebellion. Hugh Despenser was more calculating and intrusive than his predecessor. While Gaveston had sought titles and riches, Despenser aimed to dominate the governance of the realm itself. He manipulated his influence over Edward II to crush opposition and amass nearly unrivaled authority. His dealings with Isabella were deliberately cruel. He worked systematically to cut her off from allies and stifle any independent political ambition. So great was Despenser's grip on Edward that the king effectively ceased to act of his own volition. Every major decision, from military campaigns to diplomatic arrangements passed through Despenser's hands, forming a hidden monarchy governed in service of a single man's thirst for dominance. This power structure relegated Isabella to the role of ornamental queen present in public, but excluded from any substantive influence. The purge of her loyalists began with the expulsion of her French kin and advisors, severing what few supports she had left. Anyone perceived as loyal to the queen was stripped of their court appointments, exiled from the kingdom, or in some instances, imprisoned on fabricated charges. This campaign of systematic isolation aimed to render Isabella entirely reliant on the favor of Edward and Despenser. Deprived of independent allies or reliable information, the Queen's growing despair drove her to increasingly daring efforts to contact her relatives in France. Several of her clandestine envoys were caught, their letters offering Despenser supposed proof of what he framed as traitorous communication with foreign powers. These discoveries provided justification for even tighter restrictions on Isabella, curtailing her ability to move or speak freely until she was, for all intents and purposes, a captive within her own royal residence. The final blow came when Despenser persuaded Edward to confiscate Isabella's personal landshare, only source of financial independence and her ability to sustain her own court. Stripped of this income, she was forced to rely entirely on royal stipends, all of which were controlled by Despenser. This move effectively reduced her to the level of a dependent pensioner in the very kingdom she once symbolized. Chroniclers of the time documented the stark physical and emotional decline of Isabella. During these dark years, the once vibrant and admired young queen grew emaciated and visibly worn. Her ornate courtly garments unable to mask the visible signs of prolonged emotional suffering. Her behavior became increasingly erratic, marked by compulsive washing of her hands, involuntary flinching, and startled reactions to minor disturbance, evidence of psychological trauma hidden beneath royal protocol. The French mission and path to liberation. In 1325, Isabella saw her opportunity to escape, cloaked in the form of a diplomatic assignment. Her brother, Charles IV of France, was on the verge of launching war over contested claims in Gascony, and Edward II urgently required a trusted negotiator. Isabella cleverly persuaded her husband and Despenser that her lineage and familial ties positioned her perfectly for the Rollian argument that would ultimately become the turning point of Edward's reign. Her negotiations for this mission revealed just how much political savvy Isabella had developed in captivity. She couched her appeal not as a bid for autonomy, but as a selfless act for England's benefit. She highlighted her hesitancy to leave her children, her preference for remaining in England, and her deep concern for Edward's well-being during her absence. Despenser initially resisted the proposal, rightly fearing that a queen with freedom and access to French influence could mobilize forces against him. But Isabella's tactful framing of the diplomatic necessity, combined with Edward's real need for conflict resolution, eventually silenced his objections. The arrangements for her journey were detailed and tightly monitored. Her entourage was handpicked by Despenser. Her instructions were dictated by Edward's council. English agents were tasked with tracking her every move on French soil. What seemed to be a diplomatic honor for Isabella was, in fact, another attempt to extend her captivity, this time under foreign skies, but still beneath English authority. Isabella's arrival in Paris in March 1325 marked the first moment in nearly 2 decades that she had escaped the watchful eye of English surveillance. The psychological effect of this liberation was both swift and profound. French contemporaries observed that within days of her arrival, the Queen seemed to reclaim her vitality. Her spine straightened, Her voice gained confidence, and the haunted look that had lingered in her eyes during her final years in England began to fade. The reception she received at the French court reflected the extent to which her plight had been observed and quietly mourned by foreign dignitaries. King Charles IV and Queen Jean treated Isabella with a mixture of familial warmth and measured reverence, recognizing in her both a valuable diplomatic figure and a woman deeply scarred by trauma who needed space and time to restore her composure and resolve. Isabella's shift from envoy to exile unfolded gradually as she came to terms with the reality that returning to England meant surrendering herself once again to Despenser's control. Her letters to Edward grew increasingly ambiguous, her official communications critical of English governance, and her personal decisions began to stray from the roles and behaviors expected of her by the English crown: the lover, the invasion, and the retribution. Isabella's alliance with Roger Mortimer, banished English baron, who would become both her lover and her strategic partner, was more than a romantic entanglement. It was a calculated union between two survivors of Despenser's regime, united by a common goal: vengeance. Together, they would orchestrate one of the most consequential revolts in England's medieval history. Mortimer had fled to France in 1323 after a daring escape from the Tower of London, following the collapse of his rebellion against Edward II and Despenser. A seasoned warrior and shrewd political actor, Mortimer brought to their alliance the military discipline and ruthless tactics that Isabella lacked. While she offered the authority of royalty and access to French support, their partnership was at first entirely strategic, born from shared outrage and ambition. Over time, however, a personal bond grew within their political alignment. Both had suffered long years of humiliation and powerlessness. For Isabella, Mortimer was the first man to treat her as a peer, not a pawn. For Mortimer, Isabella was more than a royal banisher, was an intellectual equal forged by years of navigating the perils of court politics. Their invasion of England took nearly a year to organize and required the careful coordination of armed forces, diplomatic leverage, and substantial funding. Isabella leveraged her queenly status to forge deals with Flemish traders, recruit German mercenaries, and win the favor of French nobility. She demonstrated an impressive grasp of logistical planning, recognizing that victory would rely on more than just indignation. Her propaganda efforts leading up to the invasion were a masterclass in medieval image-making. Rather than portraying herself as a spurned wife rebelling against her king, Isabella framed her actions as those of a devoted mother, acting to protect her son's rightful inheritance from the corrupt grip of Despenser's tyranny. This carefully crafted narrative reframed what could have been condemned as betrayal into an act of maternal devotion, tapping into the era's reverence for motherhood, which often superseded the expectations of wifely submission when the two came into conflict. The army that landed in Suffolk in September 1326 was modest in size, around 1,500 men. Yet it was a meticulously assembled alliance of Edward II's most determined opponents. Isabella had studied the failures of previous insurrections against her husband and understood that victory hinged not only on military prowess, but on the backing of both disillusioned nobles and suffering commoners who had endured Despenser's tyranny. Edward II's reaction to the invasion was marked by the same hesitation and dependency on Despenser that had plagued his reign. Instead of organizing a credible defense, he retreated westward with his favorite, effectively deserting the capital and allowing Isabella's troops to seize control of London with little resistance. This rapid unraveling of royal authority revealed just how deeply Edward's power had eroded through years of poor governance and public discontent. The terrible reckoning, the arrest and brutal execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger in November 1326, marked the final phase in Isabella's metamorphosis from powerless queen to vengeful ruler. Once unable to shield herself from humiliation, she now wielded the authority to condemn the man responsible for her suffering. The way she orchestrated Despenser's downfall highlighted both her cold strategic thinking and her grasp of the symbolic theater of medieval justice. Though his trial followed the forms of legal process, its conclusion was never in doubt. It was driven by Isabella's unrelenting pursuit of vengeance. Among the charges brought against him were treason, abuse of power, and undermining royal sovereignty. But the unspoken accusation was more personal. The calculated devastation of Isabella's dignity and peace. Historical accounts stress that Isabella personally oversaw the trial, ensuring each accusation was aired publicly and in detail. His execution was a mirror image of the cruelty he had inflicted on others. Though the sentence was the standard punishment for traitor changed, drawn, and quartered, Isabella insisted that Despenser be kept alive through the agonizing process as long as possible, prolonging his torment in a deliberate reversal of the swift deaths he had orchestrated for his victims. She observed the gruesome scene from a raised platform, her expression reportedly impassive as the man who had tormented her was destroyed. Edward II's fate proved far more complicated, requiring a balance of personal and political calculation. As both her husband and the father of the heir, Edward could not be dispatched like Despenser, yet his continued rule was untenable. The solution was to force his abdication, passing the crown to his 14-year-old son, Edward III, with Isabella and Mortimer assuming the regency until he came of age. The ceremony at Kenilworth Castle in January 1327 was orchestrated to present Edward's abdication as voluntary. Isabella, composed and unflinching, was present as her disgraced husband formally relinquished a throne he had long failed to command, just as she had stood silent and motionless during Despenser's final hour. The same man who once dismissed her presence in court now knelt in submission before delegates of her government, relinquishing the power he had never truly known how to wield. Edward II's confinement at Berkeley Castle was orchestrated to remove him from any political relevance, while maintaining the illusion of his continued existence and health. Isabella's involvement in arranging his imprisonment has remained a contentious issue among historians, but prevailing evidence points to her direct participation in determining the strict parameters of his captivity. The former monarch was kept in complete isolation, unable to communicate with allies or scheme for his return to power. The suspicious death of Edward II in September 1327, officially reported as natural but widely presumed to be an assassination, closed the chapter on Isabella's long campaign of retribution. Whether she issued the fatal command or merely orchestrated conditions that made his death inevitable, the result was the same. The last obstacle to her regency was eliminated, securing her son's unchallenged claim to the throne. The she-wolf's reign and her eventual fall between 1327 and 1330, Isabella, in alliance with Roger Mortimer, governed England during a rare moment of true political influence in her life. A woman once treated as a mere ornament of royal spectacle now ruled with strategic acumen, icy resolve, and a sense of spectacle that earned her the infamous title, the She-Wolf of France. The opening years of their joint rule were characterized by effective governance and military diplomacy. Together, Isabella and Mortimer concluded the costly and fruitless conflicts with Scotland that had bled England's resources during Edward II's reign. They negotiated a treaty that acknowledged Scottish independence in return for generous financial compensation. This realist diplomacy revealed Isabella's recognition that ruling demanded more than symbolism. It required tangible outcomes. Isabella herself underwent a striking metamorphosis. Eyewitnesses of the time remarked on her newfound poise and authority, her posture straighter, her speech more resolute. She adorned herself with opulent but functional attire, lavish textiles and ornate jewels that reinforced her regal presence, while granting her the freedom to engage in the mechanics of rule. Her bond with Mortimer during this period was unusually open by the standards of the day. Instead of pretending their alliance was purely political, they attended court together, undertook royal progresses as a pair, and made little effort to obscure their closeness. This honesty was politically perilous, yet personally emancipating for Isabella, who had hidden behind royal formality for most of her adult life. Yet the seeds of their fall were planted in their very success. As Prince Edward approached adulthood, the justification for continued rule by his mother and her consort grew increasingly fragile. A circle of courtiers jealous of Mortimer's power and weary of Isabella's dominance began whispering in the young king's ear, urging him to reclaim his throne. The end came with breathtaking speed. In October 1330, Edward III launched a daring coup at Nottingham Castle, finally seizing control from the two figures who had ruled in his name. The young monarch, backed by a cadre of ambitious nobles, captured Mortimer and seized full control of the realm. Isabella, roused by the commotion echoing through the stone halls of the castle, awoke to find herself imprisoned by the very son she claimed to have empowered through the downfall of his father. This final encounter between Isabella and Edward III encapsulated the total reversal of her fate. Once a queen who had led invasions and shaped foreign policy, she now knelt before her 18-year-old son, begging for Mortimer's life and her own survival. Edward's reply was unsentimental and strategic. Mortimer would be executed as a traitor, but Isabella would be spared not out of mercy, but in deference to her position as Queen Mother and her French royal lineage. Epilogue: The legacy of the forgotten queen. Isabella of France lived nearly 3 more decades following her abrupt fall from authority, spending those years in relative comfort, though under careful supervision. At Castle Rising in Norfolk, once feared as the she-wolf of France, she gradually disappeared from public view, reduced to a historical afterthought, overshadowed by the legacies of her husband and son. Her shift from powerful regent to overlooked dowager highlights the fragile and conditional nature of a woman's power in medieval governance. Isabella deliberately withdrew from political life during her later years, choosing a quieter existence. She managed a small household, received a generous stipend from Edward III, and devoted her time to religious reflection and acts of charity. According to some contemporaries, this secluded life may have brought Isabella a sense of peace, perhaps, the first she had known since her childhood in France. Her interactions with her son during this period were polite and carefully orchestrated. Edward III honored her with occasional visits and formal respect, but he drew clear limits around her role and influence. She attended major court events and family gatherings, but always as a respected observer rather than a political participant. This balance preserved mutual dignity while affirming their newly defined relationship. The historical evaluation of Isabella of France has long been shaped by the sensational aspects of her narrative and the restrictive lens of medieval gender norms. Chroniclers alternately revered her as a loyal mother and vilified her as a transgressive wife, underscoring the difficulty of fitting a woman like Isabella into traditional molds of femininity. In recent times, historians have taken a more empathetic view, acknowledging Isabella as a survivor of sustained abuse who leveraged remarkable intelligence and resilience to exact her revenge. When she passed away in 1358, at the age of 63, chroniclers recorded her death. Though without significant public mourning, she had outlived her peers, becoming a living relic of a long-gone political era. Her funeral was suitably regal, albeit subdued. She was laid to rest at Greyfriars Church in London, clad in the same wedding gown she had worn half a century earlier when, as a frightened 12-year-old girl, she began her journey into the brutal world of royal politics. The deepest sorrow in Isabella's life lies not in its dramatic episodes of power and betrayal, but in the way it exposes the deliberate dehumanization of royal children in the medieval age. Married off at 12, torn from her native culture and kin, reduced to a vessel for dynastic offspring, and ultimately remade into a political predator, Isabella's journey was the product of a society that viewed royal women not as individuals, but as strategic assets. Isabella of France endures as one of history's most enigmatic women, a paradox of victim and architect, child bride and kingslayer, disregarded monarch and enduring icon. Her life story brings to light the devastating costs of political unions, the corrosive nature of unchecked authority, and the astonishing strength of the human soul under prolonged torment. Ultimately, Isabella was neither the pure-hearted casualty nor the cold manipulator that various narratives have suggested, but rather something more complex and unsettling. She was a girl shattered by the iron machinery of monarchical politics, who then learned to wield that same machinery with devastating effect. Though often overlooked, the exiled Queen of England has never been entirely erased from memory, because her life captures timeless truths about domination, womanhood, and power that outlive the context of 14th century dynastic conflict. From powerless child to ruling regent, and finally a captive once again, Isabella's story encapsulates the full spectrum of the female medieval condition, its fleeting potential and its enduring constraints. Her true legacy lies not in the thrones she influenced, but in the haunting questions her path continues to pose about the price of power and what survival costs in a world that allowed women so few options and even fewer chances at redemption.